It was May 1944. Every intelligence analyst in Nazi Germany knew that the Allies were preparing to invade Europe. The only questions were, where and when. The German High Command had fortified the entire Atlantic coast from Norway to Spain. They had built the Atlantic Wall, a series of defensive fortifications designed to repel any Allied invasion. They had positioned panzer divisions. They had established observation posts. They had prepared for the invasion everyone knew was coming. But the Germans had a critical resource problem. They couldn't defend everywhere with equal strength. They had to concentrate their forces where the invasion was most likely to occur. German intelligence believed the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. It made strategic sense. The distance from England was shortest. The port facilities were excellent. The route to Germany was most direct. The Germans were wrong. The actual invasion was planned for Normandy, 200 miles to the west, but the Allies couldn't simply announce this. They needed the Germans to remain convinced that Pas de Calais was the target. They needed to deceive the most sophisticated military intelligence apparatus in the world, and they did it through one of the most audacious deception operations in military history, Operation Bodyguard. And at the heart of that operation was a component that would make German pilots question their own eyes: Operation Quicksilver. The Allies were going to fill the skies of southern England with fake aircraft. Hundreds of them, thousands of them. So many that German reconnaissance pilots would report massive air armadas preparing to strike at Pas de Calais. And when those German pilots realized the planes were fake, when they finally understood the scope of the deception, it would be too late. The architect of illusion. The man responsible for creating the fake Air Force was Colonel John Bevan, head of the London Controlling Section, a secretive British military intelligence unit tasked with strategic deception. Bevan understood something fundamental about military intelligence. Confirmation bias is stronger than evidence. If you can make your enemy believe something, they will interpret all subsequent evidence to support that belief. They will see what they expect to see. The Germans expected a massive air armada in southern England, preparing to strike at Pas de Calais. So Bevan would give them exactly that. Or rather, he would give them the appearance of that. But creating fake aircraft that could fool German reconnaissance wasn't simple. The Germans had excellent aerial photography capabilities. They had experienced intelligence analysts. They had multiple sources of information, including signals intelligence, human intelligence, and aerial reconnaissance. A fake air force would need to be sophisticated. It would need to fool cameras. It would need to fool visual observation. It would need to fool radio intercepts. It would need to create the electromagnetic signature of real aircraft. It would need to generate the heat signatures that infrared detection would pick up. Bevan assembled a team that included some of Britain's most creative engineers, artists, and intelligence officers. Their mission: create an air force that looked absolutely real from the air, but was actually made of wood, canvas, and rubber. They had 6 months to do it. The engineering challenge, the technical requirements for fake aircraft were demanding. German reconnaissance flights typically photographed from altitudes of 20,000 to 30,000 feet. At that altitude, photographic resolution was good enough to distinguish real aircraft from obvious fakes. The fake aircraft would need to have the correct dimensions, the correct shadows, the correct reflective properties. They would need to be positioned in patterns that matched real airfield layouts. They would need to show signs of activity: maintenance vehicles, fuel trucks, personnel moving around them. The team developed several types of fake aircraft. Type A, full-scale wooden replicas. These were constructed from plywood and timber. They had the correct external dimensions and were painted to match real aircraft. They weighed about 100 pounds, light enough to be moved by 2 men but substantial enough to remain stable in wind. Cost approximately $30 each. Type B, inflatable rubber aircraft. These were made from rubberized canvas. They could be inflated using hand pumps in about 10 minutes. They were lighter and more portable than wooden replicas, but more vulnerable to wind damage. Cost approximately $10 each. Type C, canvas and frame aircraft. These used a lightweight metal frame covered with painted canvas. They were a compromise between the stability of wooden replicas and the portability of inflatables. Cost approximately $20 each. All 3 types were designed to be painted with special reflective paint that would photograph correctly under different lighting conditions. The paint was formulated to match the reflective properties of aluminum aircraft fuselages, but visual deception was only the first challenge. The fake aircraft also needed to fool other forms of reconnaissance. The electromagnetic deception German intelligence didn't rely solely on visual reconnaissance. They also monitored radio communications and radar signatures. British engineers developed radio transmitters that could be positioned near the fake aircraft. These transmitters broadcast signals that simulated the radio traffic of active air bases, pilot communications, ground control instructions, maintenance reports. The radio traffic was carefully scripted to be realistic. It included mundane details, weather reports, equipment failures, meal schedules. It included the kind of routine chatter that would characterize a real airbase preparing for a major operation. The transmitters operated on frequencies known to be monitored by German intelligence. The goal was not to transmit secret information, but to transmit the kind of routine information that would confirm German suspicions about Allied invasion preparations. Additionally, engineers developed devices that could simulate the radar signature of aircraft. These devices, called corner reflectors, used angled metal surfaces to reflect radar waves in ways that mimicked aircraft. Placed near fake aircraft, they would make German radar systems detect what appeared to be real planes. The electromagnetic deception was as important as the visual deception. The Germans trusted their technical intelligence. If their radios and radars detected aircraft, they would be more likely to believe their aerial photographs. The construction, from December 1943 to May 1944, British factories produced over 500 fake aircraft. Wooden workshops constructed plywood replicas. Rubber factories manufactured inflatables. Artists painted each aircraft with meticulous attention to detail. The fake aircraft were distributed to airfields across southern England, particularly in Kent and Sussex, the areas closest to Pas de Calais. They were positioned at real airfields alongside real aircraft, making it difficult for German reconnaissance to distinguish fake from real. But the placement was strategic. Real aircraft were positioned in ways that would be visible from certain angles. Fake aircraft were positioned to fill in the gaps, creating the appearance of far more aircraft than actually existed. Ground crews were trained to move the fake aircraft periodically, simulating the kind of activity that would occur at a busy airbase. They positioned fake maintenance vehicles. They created fake tire tracks. They even positioned dummy personnel that looked like ground crew working on the aircraft. From 30,000 feet through a reconnaissance camera, the scene looked completely authentic. Airfields that actually had 50 real aircraft appeared to have 200. Bases that were relatively quiet appeared to be hives of activity. By April 1944, German reconnaissance was reporting massive concentrations of Allied aircraft in southeastern England. German intelligence estimated the Allies had assembled over 1,500 aircraft for the invasion. The actual number of combat-ready aircraft was about half that. But the Germans believed what they saw. They believed the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, and they positioned their defenses. Accordingly, the German reconnaissance Luftwaffe, reconnaissance pilots flew regular missions over southern England. Throughout early 1944, these missions were dangerous. British fighters patrolled constantly. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned to protect strategic sites. Many German reconnaissance aircraft were shot down, but some made it through, and the pilots who did photographed what appeared to be exactly what German intelligence expected: massive preparations for an invasion at Pas de Calais. One German reconnaissance pilot, Oberleutnant Hans Weber, flew multiple missions over Kent in April 1944. In his post-war memoirs, Weber described what he observed. The airfields were packed with aircraft: fighters, bombers, transport planes. They were parked in neat rows, clearly visible. I photographed them from multiple angles during several missions. The images were analyzed by intelligence officers who confirmed they were genuine Allied aircraft preparing for operations. What struck me was the sheer number. Every airfield I photographed was at capacity. Some had aircraft parked on grass strips beyond the normal parking areas. It was clear the Allies were assembling a massive air force. Weber and other reconnaissance pilots had no idea they were photographing fake aircraft. The deception was too sophisticated. The fake aircraft looked exactly like real aircraft from the altitudes they were photographing, but there were subtle clues that something wasn't right. clues that German intelligence analysts should have noticed but didn't. The anomalies: some German intelligence analysts began to notice inconsistencies in the reconnaissance photographs. First, the aircraft at some airfields never seemed to move. A photographer would fly over an airfield 1 week, then fly over the same airfield 2 weeks later, and the aircraft would be in identical positions. Real aircraft preparing for combat operations would be moved regularly for maintenance, training flights, and tactical positioning. Second, some of the aircraft showed no signs of wear. Real aircraft that were being used intensively would show signs of weathering, staining from exhaust, discoloration from sun exposure. Some of the aircraft in the photographs looked too pristine, too perfect. Third, the activity patterns were unusual. Real airfields would show evidence of constant movement: vehicles, personnel, aircraft taxiing. Some of the photographed airfields showed aircraft but relatively little supporting activity. A few German intelligence analysts raised concerns. They wrote reports suggesting that some of the aircraft might be decoys. They recommended closer inspection or lower altitude reconnaissance, but these reports were ignored or dismissed. Higher command believed what they wanted to believe. The reconnaissance photographs confirmed their strategic assumptions. Why question evidence that supported their conclusions? This is the power of confirmation bias. Once you believe something, you interpret all evidence to support that belief. Contradictory evidence is dismissed as anomalous or irrelevant. The German high command believed the invasion would come at Pas de Calais. The reconnaissance photographs showed massive air forces near Pas de Calais. Therefore, the photographs must be accurate. On June 6, 1944, the Allies invaded Normandy. Not Pas de Calais, Normandy. The Germans were caught off guard. Their strongest defenses were positioned at Pas de Calais. Their panzer reserves were held back, waiting for what they believed would be the real invasion at Pas de Calais. The Normandy invasion, they initially believed, was a feint designed to draw German forces away from the true invasion site. It took several days for the German high command to realize that Normandy was the actual invasion, that the massive air forces they had detected near Pas de Calais were either non-existent, deployed elsewhere, or significantly exaggerated. Luftwaffe. Reconnaissance pilots were ordered to conduct urgent reconnaissance missions over southeastern England to verify the status of the aircraft that had been photographed there for months. On June 8th, Oberleutnant Hans Weber flew another reconnaissance mission over Kent. What he saw confused him. The aircraft were still there, Weber later wrote, in the same positions as before. But something was wrong. Some of them looked odd. The shadows were wrong. The shapes were slightly off. Weber descended to a lower altitude to get a better look, violating standard reconnaissance protocols that required high-altitude photography to avoid anti-aircraft fire. At 10,000 feet, the truth became obvious. Many of the aircraft he had photographed were fake. Wooden replicas, canvas covers over frames, inflatable decoys. I felt a wave of shock and then anger, Weber wrote. We had been deceived. The intelligence we had gathered, the photographs we had risked our lives to take, had been showing us a false picture. The Allies had created a phantom air force, and we had fallen for it completely. Weber reported his observations. Other reconnaissance pilots confirmed similar findings. Within days, German intelligence had to acknowledge that a significant portion of the aircraft they had been tracking in southeastern England were decoys. The deception had worked. The Germans had positioned their forces to defend against an invasion at Pas de Calais. By the time they realized the truth, Allied forces had established a beachhead at Normandy that couldn't be dislodged. The intelligence failure. The fake aircraft operation represented a catastrophic intelligence failure for Nazi Germany. Their reconnaissance had been accurate in one sense. The photographs showed exactly what was there. But their analysis had failed to distinguish between real and fake. German intelligence analysts conducted a post-mortem investigation. They reviewed all the reconnaissance photographs. They identified the clues they should have noticed. They wrote reports explaining how the deception had worked. One report, written by Oberst Friedrich Müller, head of Luftwaffe reconnaissance analysis, was brutally self-critical. We failed because we saw what we expected to see. We believed the Allies would invade at Pas de Calais. Every photograph that showed aircraft near Pas de Calais was interpreted as confirmation of that belief. We ignored anomalies. We dismissed inconsistencies. We accepted evidence that fit our preconceptions and rejected evidence that didn't. The British created a deception that was technically sophisticated but not perfect. A more skeptical analysis would have identified the fake aircraft. We had the tools. We had the expertise. What we lacked was the willingness to question our own assumptions. The report was classified and had minimal impact on German intelligence operations. By June 1944, the war's outcome was already becoming clear. The failure to detect the fake aircraft was just one failure among many. The Allied perspective after the war. British intelligence officers involved in Operation Quicksilver wrote their own assessments of the operation's success. Colonel Bevan noted that the fake aircraft operation had achieved its objective not through technical perfection, but through psychological manipulation. The Germans believed in a Pas-de-Calais invasion before we created a single fake aircraft. Our task was not to convince them of something new. Our task was to reinforce what they already believed. That's much easier. The fake aircraft didn't need to be perfect. They only needed to be good enough to confirm German expectations. Once confirmation bias set in, the Germans would overlook flaws and inconsistencies. They would see what they wanted to see. The true genius of the operation was not in the construction of the fake aircraft. It was in understanding German psychology and exploiting it. British engineers and artists who had constructed the fake aircraft took pride in their work. They had created a fake air force that had deceived the most sophisticated military intelligence apparatus in the world. Their plywood and canvas creations had contributed to the success of D-Day, but they also understood the limitations. The deception had worked because of circumstances: German confirmation bias, limited German reconnaissance capability, and Allied control of the skies over England that prevented close inspection. In different circumstances, with more skeptical analysts or better reconnaissance, the deception might have failed. The technical post-war analysis after the war, military intelligence agencies around the world studied Operation Quicksilver to understand how it had succeeded and what lessons could be drawn. American intelligence officers examined the fake aircraft that had been preserved. They tested them with their own reconnaissance cameras and radar systems. They tried to determine at what altitude and under what conditions the fake aircraft would be distinguishable from real aircraft. The analysis showed that the fake aircraft were effective at altitudes above 15,000 feet. Below that altitude, experienced observers could distinguish them from real aircraft. The paint didn't reflect light quite right. The shapes were slightly off. The details were missing. But at the altitudes German reconnaissance typically operated, 20,000 to 30,000 feet, the fake aircraft were indistinguishable from real aircraft in photographs. The electromagnetic deception was also effective. The radio transmitters and radar reflectors created signatures that matched real aircraft closely, enough to fool German technical intelligence. The overall assessment was that Operation Quicksilver had succeeded because it operated at the limits of German reconnaissance capability. The fake aircraft were just barely good enough to fool German cameras and sensors. A slight improvement in German reconnaissance technology would have exposed the deception, but that improvement never came. By 1944, German resources were stretched too thin. Reconnaissance units were underfunded and under-equipped. Intelligence analysis was compromised by political pressure to confirm leadership expectations. The fake aircraft succeeded not just because they were well-made, but because the Germans were ill-equipped and psychologically predisposed to believe the deception. The cost-benefit analysis. Military strategists conducted analyses of the cost and effectiveness of Operation Quicksilver compared to other forms of military deception. The operation cost approximately $50,000 to create 500 fake aircraft and supporting infrastructure. This was trivially small compared to the cost of real aircraft, $20,000 to $50,000 per aircraft, and the cost of the D-Day invasion, billions of pounds. The strategic benefit was enormous. By deceiving the Germans about the invasion location, the Allies ensured that German defenses were mispositioned. Panzer divisions that could have reinforced Normandy were held at Pas-de-Calais for weeks after D-Day military. Historians estimate that Operation Quicksilver and the broader Operation Bodyguard deception campaign saved thousands of Allied lives by reducing German defensive effectiveness at Normandy. From a cost-benefit perspective, the fake aircraft operation was one of the most effective military expenditures of World War II. A tiny investment in plywood and canvas produced strategic benefits worth billions. After World War II, military deception became a recognized component of modern warfare. The success of operations like Quicksilver demonstrated that deception could be as valuable as firepower. During the Cold War, both the United States and Soviet Union developed extensive military deception programs. They created fake military installations. They positioned dummy weapons. They broadcast false radio traffic, all based on lessons learned from World War II deception operations. The fake aircraft technique was refined and expanded. Inflatable decoys became more sophisticated. Radar signatures became more accurate. Thermal signatures were added to fool infrared detection. During the 1991 Gulf War, American forces used inflatable decoy tanks and aircraft to deceive Iraqi forces about American positions and strength. During the Kosovo conflict in 1999, Serbian forces used decoys to make NATO believe they had destroyed more military equipment than they actually had. The principle established by Operation Quicksilver remains valid. A well-crafted deception that exploits enemy confirmation bias can be more effective than actual military force. The psychological dimension. Military psychologists have studied Operation Quicksilver extensively as an example of how cognitive biases affect military intelligence. The operation succeeded because it exploited three key psychological phenomena: confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret evidence in ways that confirm existing beliefs. The Germans believed the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, so they interpreted reconnaissance showing aircraft near Pas de Calais as confirmation. Pattern recognition, the human tendency to see patterns even in incomplete or ambiguous data. The fake aircraft created patterns that matched German expectations of what an invasion preparation would look like. Authority bias, the tendency to trust information from authoritative sources. German reconnaissance pilots were considered reliable sources. Their reports were trusted without sufficient skepticism. These biases are universal. They affect intelligence analysis in every military organization. Understanding them is crucial for both conducting effective deception and avoiding being deceived. Modern intelligence training includes extensive education on cognitive biases specifically because of lessons learned from operations like Quicksilver. The modern applications. Contemporary military strategists continue to study Operation Quicksilver for insights into modern deception operations. In the age of satellite reconnaissance, GPS, and advanced sensors, creating physical fake equipment is less effective than it was in 1944. Modern reconnaissance can detect things that 1940s reconnaissance couldn't: heat signatures, electromagnetic emissions, chemical compositions. But the principle of exploiting enemy confirmation bias remains relevant. Modern military deception focuses less on physical decoys and more on electronic deception, cyber deception, and information warfare. During exercises and conflicts, militaries use fake radar signatures, false radio transmissions, deceptive cyber activities, and misleading public information to shape enemy perceptions. The fake aircraft of 1944 have evolved into fake network traffic, fake satellite telemetry, and fake social media accounts. But the underlying psychology remains the same. Make your enemy see what they expect to see. The ethical questions operation. Quicksilver raises interesting ethical questions about military deception. Deception is generally considered acceptable in warfare. All military operations involve some degree of deception. Camouflage, feints, misleading communications. The laws of war permit deception as long as it doesn't involve perfidy, misusing protected symbols like the Red Cross. But Operation Quicksilver was unusual in scale. It created a complete fictional military capability. It systematically misled enemy intelligence for months. It represents one of the most extensive peacetime deceptions in history, since the fake aircraft were created before D-Day, technically during a period when Britain and Germany were at war but before active invasion. Some ethicists have argued that such extensive deception, while legal, raises moral questions about the nature of warfare. If war is about achieving political objectives through violence, what does it mean when those objectives are achieved through deception rather than force? Others argue that deception that saves lives is morally superior to violence that takes lives. If the fake aircraft prevented Allied casualties by misleading German defenses, then it was morally positive regardless of its deceptive nature. There is no consensus on these questions, but Operation Quicksilver remains a test case for debates about the ethics of military deception. The German pilots, prospective German pilots who flew reconnaissance missions over England in 1944, carried the psychological impact of the deception for the rest of their lives. Hans Weber, the reconnaissance pilot who discovered the fake aircraft, after D-Day wrote extensively about the experience in his post-war memoirs. "The moment I realized the aircraft were fake was one of the most disorienting experiences of my life," Weber wrote. "I had been trained to trust my eyes, my camera, my instruments. Suddenly I couldn't trust anything. If the aircraft were fake, what else had been fake? How much of what we believed about Allied capabilities was deception?" The psychological impact on German reconnaissance pilots was profound. We became paranoid. We questioned every photograph, every observation. We lost confidence in our own abilities. That loss of confidence affected our effectiveness for the remainder of the war. Other German pilots described similar experiences. The revelation that they had been deceived undermined their trust in their own perception and judgment. This psychological dimension was an unintended but valuable consequence of the deception. By undermining German pilot confidence, Operation Quicksilver continued to provide benefits even after the deception was discovered. The unsung heroes, the individuals who created the fake aircraft for Operation Quicksilver, were mostly anonymous. They were engineers, artists, factory workers, and military personnel who worked on a classified project that couldn't be acknowledged publicly. After the war, some of them tried to get recognition for their work. They wrote letters to the military. They contacted historians. They wanted credit for contributing to the success of D-Day. But the British government was reluctant to acknowledge Operation Quicksilver publicly. Deception operations remained classified. The techniques used in Quicksilver might be used again. Revealing details would compromise future operations. It wasn't until the 1970s that the British government began declassifying World War II deception operations. By then, many of the people involved had died. Their contributions were finally acknowledged, but too late for them to receive public recognition. Today, there are small exhibits in military museums describing Operation Quicksilver. There are plaques at some of the airfields where fake aircraft were positioned. There are academic papers and books analyzing the operation, but the individuals who built the fake aircraft, who moved them around airfields, who maintained the deception for months, remain mostly anonymous. They are footnotes in history rather than celebrated heroes. Perhaps that's fitting. Deception operates in shadows. Those who excel at it rarely seek publicity. The measure of their success is not public recognition, but the achievement of strategic objectives through cunning rather than force. Operation Quicksilver succeeded beyond its designers' wildest expectations. It deceived the most sophisticated military intelligence apparatus of its time. It contributed directly to the success of the largest amphibious invasion in history. It saved thousands of lives by misleading enemy defenses. But its greatest achievement was demonstrating a principle that remains relevant 80 years later. Perception can be more powerful than reality. A fake air force, if believable enough, is as strategically valuable as a real air force. An enemy that believes you have overwhelming power is defeated, even if that power doesn't exist. The German pilots who photographed the fake aircraft, the intelligence analysts who believed the photographs, the commanders who positioned their forces, based on those beliefs, all of them were victims of a deception so sophisticated that it exploited fundamental aspects of human psychology. They saw what they expected to see. They believed what they wanted to believe. They ignored evidence that contradicted their assumptions. And by the time they realized they had been deceived, it was too late. The skies over southern England in early 1944 were filled with fake planes, plywood bombers, canvas fighters, inflatable aircraft that could be deflated and stored in a truck. But to German reconnaissance pilots, looking down from 30,000 feet, those fake planes looked absolutely real. They looked like an armada preparing for an invasion at Pas de Calais, and because the Germans believed what they saw, they positioned their forces to defend the wrong place. They prepared for the wrong battle. They were defeated before the invasion even began. The moment German pilots realized the sky had been full of fake planes, they understood something profound about modern warfare. In war, truth is whatever your enemy believes. Reality is whatever you can make your enemy see, and sometimes, a piece of plywood painted to look like a bomber is more powerful than a real bomber, because it's not the weapon that matters. It's what the enemy thinks you have. That was the lesson of Operation Quicksilver. A lesson written across the skies of England in wood and canvas. A lesson that German pilots learned too late. The sky was full of fake planes, and that made all the difference.